chapter 15, verses 1 through 3 and 11b through 32. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine for that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants had food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back and safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered his property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
How many here are firstborns? First child in the family? I got a couple. All right. How many here are the baby in the family, the youngest child? Oh, lots more of those. All right. Well, I have a question for the firstborns. How many of you think the babies got away with things you never could have got away with? I think even the babies of the family will admit to that at least the firstborns think the babies get away with everything, don't they? Did you ever notice it seems parents are just more lenient the more kids they have. Oh, and I'm falling behind already. Anyway, it's not always true, especially if the firstborn happens to be daddy's little girl. Jonathan Katz says his little girl has him wrapped around her little finger. He says he doesn't even try to win anymore. He finds himself saying things like, "Go to your room at your earliest convenience, okay?" Or, "You behave, Daddy's going to count to 1,500. Most parents, though, are a little more protective and demanding of their firstborn. It's natural, because it's your first attempt at being a parent. The firstborn comes along, you sterilize everything that baby might touch. You use flashcards to help them become the whiz kid. You have high expectations and hopes for that firstborn. We have a tendency to relax a little with the second. Oh, that fell on the floor? 5-second rule. You want to watch TV a little longer before starting your homework? Okay, no big deal. We tend to ease up, and it seems like every additional child, the rules get a little looser and a little looser. Research says that the firstborn, the number one child, tends to want to please the parents more. And the baby of the family tends to be more of a free spirit. I saw a lot of free spirits here this morning. That brings us to the most famous older-younger sibling story in all of literature. The story of the prodigal son. It's found in Luke 15, and in verses 11 and 12, it tells us the father had 2 sons. The older son wanted to please dad. Stay at home, work the farm. He does all the things he's been taught to do. The firstborns understand here. You realize that's the way it just is with firstborns usually. You want to please your parents. He wants to make his dad proud. The younger is probably a little more spoiled. He hasn't had the strict discipline and attention of the firstborn. So he wants to try on his wings, if you will, to sow his wild oats. It's not that he wants to hurt dad, that's not the case. He just doesn't have that overwhelming need to please his parents the way his older brother does. He's more into pleasing himself. So one day he goes to his father and he says, "Dad, I want my inheritance now. In other words, I don't want to wait till you die to enjoy myself. I want to start now. Let me have what's coming to me now." Now, I'll bet the father was tempted to give him what's coming to him. But the father truly knew his son's heart. You know, this is titled The Prodigal Son, but more appropriately might have been The Waiting Father. The story comes as part 3 in Jesus telling 3 different parables, 3 different stories, all making the same point. It starts off, as you heard Linda read, the Pharisees grumbling about how Jesus is eating with sinners. And then you notice what we skipped was 2 more stories. The first is about the shepherd who loses a sheep. And he says he'll leave the 99 to go find that one lost sheep. And when he finds it, he will celebrate. And then he tells a story about a woman who lost a coin. And she scoured the house high and low until she found it. And when she found it, she celebrated with her neighbors. And then we get to the story of today, the prodigal son. And in this one, he goes into more details. We can learn from and relate to all 3 characters in this story. The father cares about both of his boys. He goes into, the father cares about both boys, but he knows they have different needs. God is the father in this story. He loves all of us the same, but in different ways. He knows that we too have different needs. I'm having a real hard time with my slides, but I'll get it down here. Okay. We all have different needs. The younger boy wants to live life on his own terms. The father is wise enough to realize that that's the only way the boy is going to learn, the hard way. He knows this son, and he knows that that's what it's going to take. So he agrees to his son's request. Now we need to realize he doesn't cave in. It's not like the son was relentlessly badgering him. The son asks, the father knows his son, and he responds to the boy's deepest needs. Loving parents know their children, and they know that they're all different. You can't treat each child the same because each child is unique. That does make raising kids one of the most complex things we can ever do. Trying to figure out each child's personality and the different things you need to do to raise them. It's been said that you're not really a parent unless you have more than one child. And anybody with multiple children will attest to that. After the first one, it gets complicated. Loving parents know that each child is different. One size does not fit all. And wise parents adopt a different strategy for each child. You got to figure out what works. One man tells of his paper carrier. He never knew where he'd find his newspaper. Sometimes it was in the bushes, sometimes it was on the porch, sometimes it was in the lawn. But the man learned that his carrier was planning to be a basketball player. So the man put a hoop on his front porch. And now he knows exactly where to find his paper. The kid hardly ever misses. The man adopted a strategy to fit the carrier. Parents have to do that same sort of thing with their kids. It's a challenge every parent must face. Seeing each child as an individual with individual needs and dreams. Keith Miller wrote about his constant worry over his daughters. We worry about our kids, especially the daughters. But he discovered that instead of talking to God about each child's needs, he said, I started imagining that I was placing each one at a time, into my cupped hands. And then I would imagine being before God. And God also had cupped hands. And then I would open my hands and gently place each daughter in God's hands. I didn't say anything, he says. I just released them to him. Just that one act seemed to take the pressure off me to run my girls' lives. He turned his daughters over to God each day. Well, the father in our story this morning did just that. He released his young son into God's hands. The father knew the young boy would grow more rebellious if he was forced to stay at home. So he gave him the money and he let him go. You know how the story goes. He came to realize that even the worst in the care of his father were managing better than he himself had managed so far. He ended up feeding pigs and envying their rotting food. So he decided to return to Dad. And the father came running to greet him. Now that's significant. It's hard for a middle-aged man to look graceful running in a robe and sandals. In fact, in those days, it just was not done. It was absolutely inappropriate for any adult man to run in their society. But he didn't care. His young boy was home. The lost was found. And a party was declared. But what about the older boy? How does he react to his brother's return? He's mad. How many parents have heard, it's not fair, you treat him or her better than you treat me? Ever heard that from one of your kids? Anybody with more than one child has probably faced that. That's not fair. You're not being fair. have to understand it's a very human response. The son is saying, "You never killed the fatted calf for me." He feels betrayed. He stayed home. He worked hard for Dad all his life. And in reward, he's forced to attend a party for his worthless brother. This brother, the older brother, is like the Pharisees who were questioning Jesus. Remember, they were saying, how can he be dining with them? They're sinners. They're not righteous. And the older brother is saying, how come we're throwing a party for him? He's a sinner. He's no good. How often have we struggled with that same feeling? Be honest. That person has been so bad, how can they be worthy of God's blessings? I work hard all my life to please God. And yet if they ask for it, that person who's been nasty their whole life gets the same forgiveness I get. That doesn't seem right. So the question is, which brother is right? Which brother is wrong? Well, here's what we need to realize in this story this morning. Both brothers were wrong. They both didn't handle things properly. The younger brother turned his back on his father. That's pretty obvious to most of us when we read the story. But the older brother turned his back on his younger brother. Both are wrong. And honestly, each just as wrong as the other. There's a little story about the Cherry sisters. They left their home in Iowa, corn country, back in 1893. Obviously, this is a very old story. But back in 1893, they left their home, 4 girls, and they made their stage debut in Cedar Rapids in a skit they wrote themselves. And they were horrible. I mean, they stunk. And for 3 years, they performed in packed theaters throughout the Midwest. People came just to see if they were really that bad. And they were. Their unbelievably bad acting enraged critics, provoked spectators to throw vegetables. Wisely, the sisters traveled with an iron screen that they put up in front of the stage for self-defense. But amazingly, people kept coming to see how terrible they really were. And amazingly, in 1896, they were offered $1,000 a week to perform on Broadway. 7 years later, the Cherry sisters had earned a respectable fortune of $200,000. They returned to Iowa, back down on the farm. Oddly enough, the Broadway stars remained convinced to the end that they were truly the most talented actresses to grace the stage. They never knew how bad they really were. One has to wonder if the older brother in our story this morning ever really realized that he was just as guilty as his younger brother. The older brother would never stoop to the pig pen of life like his younger brother. He wouldn't carouse with prostitutes or blow his money on partying, and that's good. But his inability to forgive and love his brother was just as offensive to Jesus as the sins of the younger brother. He can't look into the heart of his brother. He has no idea what caused his brother to leave. He has no idea of the sincerity of the younger brother's repentance. That's the father's job. There are many elder brothers in this world, and I don't just mean big brothers. I mean many people like the elder brother in our story. Ann Richards once said of George Bush, he was born on third base and thought he hit a triple. I'm not saying that's the case for President Bush, but it's true for many people in the world today. They start off with so many blessings and think that's just normal, or they think they earned it. Too often we don't realize that many people aren't born with the kind of parents we have. Not everyone has the opportunities we've had. It can be tempting to point our finger and say, they aren't worthy of a place in the Father's house. They aren't worthy of a place at the Father's table. But Jesus put it very plainly. Judge not, lest ye be judged. We are all sinners. And the sin of pride is just as serious as any other sin on the list. God treats his children differently, even though he loves all of us the same. A 5th grade teacher had a contest. Every year, the contest was to present the most important sentence ever written. She asked the kids to pick one sentence from literature, which is the written word, name the author and the source, and explain why it should be considered the most important sentence ever written. There were a lot of entries like 77 years ago, or all men are created equal. To be or not to be made it on the list a few times. There were 14 entries for in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, maybe because the teacher had shared that was her favorite verse. But the sentence that won was not written by anyone famous at all. It was written on a postcard from Hawaii to one of the girls in the class. It was from her stepfather, who was on honeymoon with her mother. This right away made the teacher nervous, because they had to explain why this was the most important sentence ever written. But she let the little girl go on. And the little girl explained until she got this card, she didn't know how her stepfather felt about her. And the winning sentence, written on the back of a postcard from Waikiki Beach, said, "Charlotte, I love you." I love you. That's the greatest sentence ever written. There are many variations. Obviously, the name can change. But wherever it's heard, it's a blessing. And today, it's addressed to everyone. God is saying, come home. I love you. We're all still sinners. Whether we have turned our back on God or turned our back on our brothers and sisters, none of us has the right to judge the other. But there's good news. There's excellent news. You see, we're all invited to the party. Some of us know what it's like to be the prodigal son. There are things in our lives that we deeply regret. Times you've let your parents down, maybe your spouse down, you've let God down. But we need to know that we still have a place at God's table. God still loves you. He does. There's still room. Some of us are more like the older brother. We want to pass judgment. We notice those who aren't as righteous as us, who aren't as Christ-like as we'd like to be. But there's still a place for us at God's table too. A father had 2 sons. And while the boy was still a long ways off, the father ran to greet him. It's God who runs to greet us. Whether we are coming back from a far country, or whether we are coming in from the garden where we have been shunning our brother, the greeting is the same. Welcome home, son. Welcome home, daughter. I love you. So let's let the party begin.